Hello, all good? And good morning, bonjour. I'm very happy to be here with you today in Tokyo to share an overview of my current research, the origin and spread of sans serif letterforms in France during the July monarchy. And thank you ATypI for having me here today. And first of all, I would like to thank all these people and institutions. They were very helpful in many ways for this investigation that started as a pastime and appealingly became a fascinating research project. I am especially indebted to Nicolette Gray, James Mosley, and Michael Twyman's trailblazing work on the history of letterforms and printing techniques in the 19th century. Fortunately, there is still a lot to uncover and study in their footsteps regarding this subject. I apologize for the uneven quality of the images. Some documents were sometimes difficult to photograph or digitize, but I decided to include them. And big kudos to Innovation Hall and the translator. The July monarchy was an eventful period in French history, marked by a continuous fierce fight for social justice. It started with a revolution in 1830 that established a liberal constitutional monarchy and ended with another revolution in 1848 and the advent of the short-lived Second Republic. In spite of this difficult context, it was also a significant era of transformation of everyday life, brought about by the Industrial Revolution in many countries affected by the growth of mass production and consumerism, urbanization, and the development of rail transport. France was also embracing the global explosion of information and advertising, the proliferation and diversification of publishing companies alongside the rise of literacy. Public elementary school was established in 1833. Not forgetting the ubiquity of images thanks to lithography and woodblock engraving, the invention of photography, and the free gift of the daguerreotype process to the world by the French government in 1839. The rise of Romanticism in France during the 1820s triggered a crucial shift in literature and arts. A few months before the July Revolution, the first performance of Hernani took place at the Théâtre Français in Paris. This historical play written by the already famous author named Victor Hugo sparked a lively confrontation between his romantic supporters and the partisans of classic theater. This new modern aesthetic intended to give a more balanced depiction of the passions tormenting the human nature and to reach the sublime through the risible and the grotesque. Ugliness mattered as much as beauty. The romantic aesthetic could only thrive through this contrast. Romantic literature quickly found its readership thanks to the support of several publishers. The bookseller Eugène Renduel arguably became the most influential of them. He began to publish on a regular basis the books of Victor Hugo and other writers, with the collaboration of a new generation of artists and engravers such as Tony Joanneau or Célestin Nanteuil. This synergy also favored the appearance of new, unseen letterforms. They represent the less conspicuous of all these novelties, but nonetheless took part in this change. At first, they were used for titles and captions of prints and illustrations. It is quite challenging to credit illustrators and engravers for their authorship. These letterforms, as you can see, are rudimentary, crude, emollient. It is tempting to call this style grotesque, though this term, as you may know, is related to a range of sans serif typefaces produced by the Farragut foundry in London around the same time. So let's call it by default the romantic letter. Célestin Nanteuil drew many frontispieces and illustrations for Renduel's books during the 1830s. Some of his images explicitly point out this romantic letter as if it played a part in Hugo's drama. Within a few years, these letterforms would disseminate and evolve outside the Romantic sphere, as we'll see later in this presentation. The relations between publishers, printers, and type foundries were also fruitful. It is interesting to note that Victor Hugo's second and definitive edition of Notre-Dame de Paris, published by Randuel in 1832, was printed by Joseph Raymond Plassan with the types of Marcellin-Legrand. Plassan and Legrand were then managing in partnership the foundry of Henri Didot. Around 1834, the same foundry introduced the first sans serif types in France, named Lettres centrées, literally letters without strokes, stroke meaning serif in this context. Two sizes were produced, as you can see in this leaf. 2 points de Parisienne, roughly 9 points, and 2 points de petit texte, 16 points. This shaded, or rather reversed shaded design was perfectly in tune with the broad range of shaded display types available then in most French and European foundries. These lettres centrées were rapidly adopted by printers. The fashion magazine La Mode slightly modified its cover between October 1834 and January 1835, using the smallest size. They were possibly inspired by another typeface cut in a single size. The Brevier Grotesque Shaded, 8 points, from the Farragut foundry in London around 1834, the same year, according to the dates mentioned on the earliest specimens showing both. They are different, though their design concept is definitely the same. And with much irony, the Lettres centrées could be found a few years later in the catalogues of the Henry Castellan foundry, renamed Bourgeois Shaded and Mignon to Line Shaded. The Castellan foundry had probably bought matrices from Marcellin-Legrand. This fact sheds a bit of light on the international commercial exchanges between foundries at that time. It is to be hoped that one can map these exchanges someday with the aim to get a better understanding of the European type market. This style may have influence over letterforms that can be found in many lithographic printing items. Sheet, music was then another fast-growing publication sector alongside the emergence of the entertainment industry. It provided work to illustrators and lettering artists whose names are sadly lost for the most today. Sans serif letters were not at the forefront of the eclecticism in vogue at the time, but took their place little by little, every so often with an unusual sense of invention. Lithographic printing overflows with astonishing discoveries such as this title page for an album of plates displaying cashmere shows. Whatever the subject could be, a unique sense of formal freedom springs from these examples. Even Jean Midol, one of the most innovative letter designers of this period, slightly experimented with the Romantic letter and tried to tame its fluffiness. Apart from this Romantic style, there were many other engraved and drawn outline letterforms in France used for title pages and captions. They were called lettres blanches, literally white letters. New sans serif outline styles appeared, often as a one-shot, like in the standout title page designed for an illustrated edition of the Histoire de Gil Blas de Santillane, a 18th century picaresque novel returned in favor and in print. Or in the new illustrated edition of Notre-Dame de Paris, published still by Randuel in 1836. Besides these examples, a few outline sans serif types were adapted from English models. The Blake and Stephenson foundry in Sheffield was among the first to produce such open sans serif around 1833. And the Laurent and the Berny foundry in Paris put forward their own take on this design as early as 1836. As for the Marcellin-Legrand foundry, it introduced around 1837 an outline shaded sans italic cut in a single size, the deux points de mignon, 14 points. It feels like an original design, possibly drawing from a peculiar piece of lettering. This lettering example, taken from another music score title page, is subsequent to the typeface release date. Though it is not a faithful imitation, it might have been inspired by this typeface. But one must remain careful when attempting to undo this intricate ball of influences and to speculate on the origins of models and styles. A new kind of sans-serif display typeface appeared in around 1836, a crucial year for the growth of the newspaper trade. The journalist, publisher, and politician Émile de Girardin launched a new daily newspaper the 1st of July, simply named La Presse. Girardin astutely decided to cut by half the subscription price and introduced paid advertisement in the last page, a successful move that was soon imitated by his competitors. These ads were set in various types, but the first bold, plain sans-serif types made in France showed up almost immediately in La Presse. Other newspapers jumped on the bandwagon and used these new types, also for mastheads. They were probably designed in response to the bold sans-serif abounding since the beginning of the decade in the British foundries. At this moment in my research, it's still uncertain which was the first foundry to produce and sell them in France. The earliest examples shown in the specimen are dated 1838 and were released by the Duclosel foundry in Paris. You can notice the unsteady consistency of these four sizes. Furthermore, they were now named antiques. This term lasted until the second half of the 20th century before being replaced by linéal, as coined by Maximilien Vaux for his classification, adopted by ATypI in 1962. Soon, most foundries began to use this term and produced their own version, creating by this way a common general pattern. One should mention that there were approximately 30 foundries in business around 1840 in Paris, some releasing original types and others operating as resellers. Assessing the authority of many typeface designs is another lengthy and daunting task. Sometimes the types gathered in this new category were not always related. A very few indeed could be considered as antique, as their design was rooted in the ancient Greek and Latin sans-serif inscriptions, such as the small sizes in this specimen leaf from the Tarbes foundry. Antiques swiftly pervaded the world of print and could be found on book covers, or posters, wood type, or lithographic imitation, but also on shop signs, shop fronts, and street signs. They remained popular well into the 20th century, sometimes as an overlooked national heritage, sometimes as a surviving ruin. Sign painting was another booming trade in the 1830s, taking advantage of the growth of business and advertising in cities. In 1834, a monthly magazine dedicated to craftsmen working in house painting and decoration, the Journal des peintres en bâtiment et en décor, was created and was published until 1842. Probably the first of its kind in France, it includes many detailed articles on sign painting techniques and trends, as well as regular series of plates. According to several of these articles, the fashionable style back then was the Egyptian or slab serif. But sans serif had already taken its place in the repertoire. It could be a very simple, basic design, quite close actually to the slab serif shown here below. Or a possible adaptation, or an engraved or drawn model taken from an album or a poster. The surviving photographic images taken in Paris and other cities in France in the 1840s show very few examples of painted sans serif signs. But their numbers slowly increased during the following decade, as you can see in this early photograph of Charles Marville taken at the Innocents Market in Paris around 1851. The sign painter could even be portrayed in action as a literal figure, the craftsman contemplating a painted poster inside a printed poster. Or as an allegorical figure as drawn here by Granville for a poster advertising the subscription for his new book and deploying a wide range of seemingly painted letter forms. In the meantime, the Romantic letter continued to diversify, more malleable than ever, and to bloom in lithographic posters, especially printed for booksellers and publishers. This subgenre of book advertising welcomed further variations and new styles, sometimes combined in the same composition. It is safe to say that many interesting sans serif letter forms were made during the 1840s for these posters. After all these years, was there any connection between the lithographic and the letterpress printing trades? Were any of these letter forms adapted as a typeface? The only known examples so far come from a rare specimen album published in 1842 by the Dubré du Forçant foundry in Paris. However, these types were probably coming from the Dumont foundry in Brussels, which was recently bought out by Dubré du Forçant. They were likely made during the previous decade. 3 shaded typefaces, appropriately named romantic, cut in a single size, are shown in this specimen. They are certainly derived from lithographic letter forms, and I hope to find them in use someday. As you may have noticed, all the typefaces shown today only comprise capital letters, sometimes punctuation and figures. Sans serif typefaces with lower cases really began to emerge in the 1850s in Europe. However, a few interesting forerunners appeared in other fields in the late 1830s. The satirical fashion magazine Aujourd'hui, Bulletin des Modes Ridicules, included hand-colored lithographed prints by Henri Gérard Fontalard. It is not known if he also wrote the captions and title below each image. One can be amazed by this minuscule handwritten sans serif, even if clumsy, and its weight variations, emulating a typographic hierarchy that was still underway and built upon serif typefaces. Other scarce, fully developed examples of minuscule sans serif exist. And it would not be surprising to discover more, though they didn't seem to become widespread. Perhaps the most accomplished sans serif letter forms of the era in France were designed by the paleographer and calligrapher Joseph Balthazar Sylvestre. The title page of the first volume of Paléographie Universelle, a collection of writing facsimiles published by the Firmin Didot brothers, is a manifold treasure trove, beautifully engraved by Jules Giraud and comprising several shaded sans serif letters. An even more stunning example can be found in his Alphabet album, published in October 1843. This series of engraved plates reproduced in lithographic printing, mixing historical models and inventions, contains 2 sans serif alphabets with capital and minuscule letters. Compared with the other sans serif design at that time, they are in a class of their own and remain an enigmatic and anachronism, a welcome glitch in the often too linear historical account of letter forms. They invoke typefaces that were yet to appear 80 years later, at least. What could have been the sources and ideas of Sylvestre for drawing such groundbreaking designs? I could go on and unveil more sides of this kaleidoscopic investigation, but it's time to bring my talk to a close. I hope it provided you with a clear insight into this broad and exciting subject. During its early years of presence in type and lettering, sans serif didn't become a prominent, pervasive letterforms in everyday life. It slowly took a seat at the quiet of a crowded table and kept it. My research exceeds the small period presented today. There are more comprehensive thematic lectures and articles in the work, and perhaps a substantial publication before I die. Subete Waima. Thank you.